Alrighty, so this is where we left off in the previous lesson. We finished up our UI for the Films View controller, but I'm noticing a couple of things. First off, we forgot to apply the custom view to our view right here. And these labels in our stack views, they're a little too close together. So let's go ahead and fix all that. So I'm going to select our view right here. We're going to change the custom class to black BG view. There we go, and that screwed up some of the interface builder stuff, but don't worry, that'll fix itself later. And then we're going to select our stack view and go ahead and come to its attributes inspector and change the spacing to 8. There we go, that looks better. I'm going to save that. And let's get talking about our model and our API files that we got to build. Let's go ahead and open up our FilmsAPI API again real quick just to review what we're going to be putting into our structure. We have the title, episode ID, crawl, director, producer, and release date. All right, so let's go ahead and go through the process that we've been working on. We're going to create our structure first. So I'm going to right click on model folder and say new file. And this is a Swift file. I'm going to say next, and we're going to call this film and say create. All right, so this is going to be a structure. We're going to call it film. We are going to conform to the codable protocol, and our fields, they are going to be let title of type string, let episode of type string, let crawl of type string, let director of type string, let producer of type string, and let release date of type string. Okay, and I'll tell you right now, there's a bug here, and I want you to see if you can figure it out just by looking at what I have here and what I have here. All right. So if you can't find it, it'll manifest itself quickly when we try to run this. But yeah, see if you can find it. All right, so we have an enumerator here, coding keys, because some of our names here differ from the JSON keys. All right, so I'm going to say coding key, and then we need to add our cases here. So we have title, and that's fine, but then we have episode. And that, let's see what that is. We have episode underscore ID. All right, so we have here episode underscore ID. Then we have director, and that's fine as is. Then we have the crawl, and that is different. That is opening underscore crawl. There we go. And then the rest of them are the same. So we have director, producer, and oops, forgot the case there, case. And then we have release date. And this one, I misspoke, this one is also different. So we have here release underscore date. All right, so that looks good. And it looks like I accidentally did 2 directors. There we go. All right, so that is looking good. Next thing we need to do is create our film API. So here on our services, I'm going to right click and say new file. And this is going to be a Swift file. And we're going to call this film API and create. Okay, so again, this is going to be pretty similar, but this time I'm going to make you type it out because you can't just do something once and then copy that from now on. You got to keep doing it so that you get that really cemented knowledge. All right, so we have our class and it is Films API. Then we are going to create our function that is going to get the film from the API. Okay, so we're going to say func get film, and we are going to pass into this function a URL of type string. And then we have our completion, and that is going to be of a type that we need to create. So I'm going to come down here to constants, and we're going to create a new type alias, and we're going to call this film response completion. And the type is we are going to input a film structure, and we're going to return nothing, void. All right, so that looks good. Come back to our FilmSAPI.Swift and put in @escaping and film response completion. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now we need to get our URL and turn that into a URL object. So I'm going to say guard let URL is equal to URL, and we're going to initialize that with a string, and we're going to pass in the string URL that is passed into this function. And if that doesn't work out for us, then we're just going to return, and then we can use our Alamo Fire request. So we're going to need to import Alamo Fire, and we're going to say Alamo Fire. And yes, if you're wondering why Alamo Fire doesn't just auto-populate, I don't know. It's as long as I've been using Alamo Fire, that's never worked. I do not know why, but we say Alamo Fire.request. We pass in the URL, and then we want a response handler of JSON. So we want response JSON, and then press return, and then rename this to response. And then we're going to do a check to make sure that the error is nil. So I'm going to say if let error is equal to response.result.error. And I was having a discussion with a student about Alamo Fire and the response. And let's go ahead and take a look at what is inside of the response, shall we? So if you recall from the URL session, when we did our completion handler right here in the closure, we got like a URL response, we got data, and we got error. Now, if we click on .response.json, if I do command and click, we can say jump to definition. And let's see here, we want in Alamo Fire, this is probably fine. And we need to find a data response. Here we go. So I'm going to right click, or I'm going to command click on data response and say jump to definition. And here you can see that this is a structure, and we have here request, response, data, and result, okay? And we have things like the request. This is the URL request. This encapsulates the two basic data elements of a load request, the URL and the policy. Then we have the HTTP URL response. This is what we get back from the server when we make a web request. This has information like the status codes. So for instance, if it was a successful web request, we get a 200 response. Then we have the data returned by the server, and you'll see that this is of type data. So this is the actual data that is returned in like byte format, all right? And then we have here result, and this is the result of the response serialization. And if we click on result here, command and click, you'll see that we have that this is an enumerator, and we have two options, success and failure. And if it is successful, then we are returned a value. If it is a failure, then we get nil back, okay? So that's why we have to unwrap the value. Okay, so just a little foray into the Alamo Fire code to hopefully better understand a little bit what this data response entails. All right, so back to our FilmsAPI. Here we are checking for our error. If there is an error, we are going to debug print that. And so we're going to say error dot localized description. We're going to say completion nil, and we are going to return out of this function. If there is no error, let's go ahead and get our data. So I'm going to say guard let data is equal to response dot data, else we are going to say return and completion is nil. Once we have our data, we can go ahead and decode it. But first we're going to need a JSON decoder. So I'm going to say let JSON decoder equal JSON decoder. And then we use the JSON decoder to decode it, and we have to do that within a do catch block though. So I'm going to say do and catch. And this is because the JSON decoder.decode method can throw an error. And when we have a method that throws an error, we have to safely call it by implementing the do, try, catch format. So I'm going to say let film equal try. So we're going to try to decode it using our JSON decoder, JSON decoder.decode. And the type that we expect from this is film.self. And then from the data that we just unwrapped. And if that's successful, we are going to say completion and pass in the film instance that was just decoded and created for us. If that doesn't work and we have an error, we're going to go ahead and debug print that. So we're going to say error.localized description, and then we're going to say completion is nil. All right, and there we have our Films API. Just going to clean this up a little bit, and that all looks good. All right, going to save that. And now we can jump into our Films View Controller. All right, so let's hop over there, Films VC, and let's go ahead and create an instance of our API. So I'm going to say let API equal Films API. And then if you remember from our Vehicles View Controller, we're also going to create a Films array of type string, and we're going to initialize that to an empty array. We're also going to need to keep track of which film we are currently on as we toggle through the potentially multiple films. And we're going to set that to 0 at the beginning though. And then here we're going to set our array of films equal to person.film URLs. And we also need to start out with our previous button and next button in their correct states. The previous button always starts out disabled because we start out at index 0, so we can't go backwards. And then we're going to do a check to see if next button should be enabled or disabled. So we're going to say next button.isEnabled is equal to films.count is greater than 1. And remember that we are setting isEnabled equal to the result of this condition. So this will evaluate to true or false, and that will be the value that next button.isEnabled is set to. Okay, so now we need to get the first film URL so that we can, on ViewDidLoad, we can load the first film. So I'm going to say guard let first film equal films.first else return. All right, that looks good. And then we are going to need to get that first film. So let's go ahead and create a function for that. I'm going to say func get film, and let's pass into it a URL of type string. And then we're going to use our API to call get film. We're going to pass in the URL, then tab over, press enter, and rename this film type that we get in the closure to film. Okay, so now we have access to this film object from the closure in our API.getFilm function. Now it is optional, so we need to unwrap it. So I'm going to say if let film is equal to film. Then we are going to say we're going to need a function to use this unwrapped film object to set the UI for all of our labels. So let's create a function for that. I'm going to say func set up view, and we are going to go ahead and pass into it a film object of type film, and we are going to use that to set all these values here. So let's go through it. We have our title label, and the text is equal to film.title. We have the episode label.text, and that is equal to film. Let's see here, episode. Then we have the director label.text, and that is equal to film.director. Then we have the producer label.text, and that is equal to film.producer. Then we have the released label.text, and that is equal to film.released data. Oh, looks like I have a typo on that. Oh well, that's fine. Then we have the crawl label dot text is equal to film dot crawl. All right, and let's go ahead and do our previous click and next click as well. So here in the set button state, we need to do a check to see if we need to enable or disable our next and previous button. The condition for our next button is to see whether we are on the final URL of our array. So we say next button dot is enabled. We're going to be using our ternary operator here. So if you recall, we have the value that we want to set. Then we provide the condition to be evaluated. So I'm going to say current film is equal to films dot count -1. Okay, so this condition, if we are on the last film URL of our array, then if that evaluates to true, then we set is enabled equal to false. Because since we're on the last URL, we cannot go any further or else we will make it crash. Otherwise, if that condition evaluates to false, we are not on the last URL, so we can go further. So we set is enabled equal to true. And same thing for previous button dot is enabled. That condition is we disable it if the current film is on the first index. Okay, so current film is equal to 0. If that evaluates to true, then is enabled is false. Otherwise, it is true. And then we call get film URL, and the URL that we pass is films at the current film index. And then in each of these, we say set button state and set button state. All right, that looks good. And then here, now that we have our setup view function, we can call that right here. We're in a closure, so we have to call self.setUpView, and we pass in the film. And now that we have our get film and everything else set up on view.did.load, we can pass in the first URL here. So I'm going to say get film, and we are passing in the first film URL. And that should pretty much do it, except for that bug I told you about. Did you figure it out? Well, you're about to see it. All right, so I'm going to save this and run it. Alrighty, so I'm going to click on random, which isn't too random right now because we still have Luke Skywalker's number hard-coded. But let's go ahead and click on our films here. And we see down here the data couldn't be read because it is missing. Interesting. Alright, so let's see what's going on. Let's come back to our film.swift file and check out our properties. Alright, we have string for everything, which is the way that it's been up until this point. But let's check out our SWAPI results here. And, ooh, interesting. All of these are enclosed in quotation marks except for episode ID. So it looks like we have our very first instance of the value not being a string. And this is an integer. So we are going to come back to our Xcode structure, and we are going to change episode to int here. And then what we're going to have to do is come back to Films VC, and let's see here, right here, episode label. We're going to need to change this to be string interpolated, or we can just initialize it as a string like this. All right, so let's save that and try that again. All right, click on random, get Luke, and click on our films. And it looks like something is still not correct. The data couldn't be read because it is missing. This one was not a planned bug, so let me see what we got going on. Alrighty, so I'm back in the film structure, and I realized what I did wrong. This is not the correct enumerator. We want coding keys. There we go. So I'm going to save that. But I also realized something else that I did. Here in FilmsVC.swift, I have set button state twice. This is supposed to be current film and this is previous clicks, we say minus equal 1. So we decrement it by 1. And then over here, we say current film, and that should be plus equals 1. I'm going to save that. And then one other thing that I noticed is here in the storyboard, we forgot to set our button classes to be the fade enabled button. So selecting previous and next, grab our custom class and set this equal to fade enabled button. And I'm going to save that and check out FilmsVC one more time. And hopefully that should be working now. I'm going to save that and run. All right, clicking on random, and we have Luke Skywalker. Click on films, and here we go. This is looking better. All right, so we have our properties up here, title, etc. Previous is disabled, as we should expect. Clicking on next takes us to the next film. That loads up. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Now, there is something that I think I would like to remove here in the crawl. I think I want to get rid of, if you check out in FilmsAPI, for the crawl, we have the line breaks here. This /n is creating a line break. And I think I want to see what it looks like if we get rid of that. And the way that we can do that is we can say let stripped, and we're going to strip out that character. So I'm going to say film dot, or is equal to film dot crawl dot replacing characters of string protocol with string protocol. Okay, so we're going to be replacing occurrences of anywhere that we see a \n. We are going to replace that with just an empty string. And then we're going to set the crawl label.text equal to this stripped string here. So let's see how that looks. All right, click on random and go to our films. And that looks interesting. Let's go ahead and also strip out the /r, okay? So what we can do here is we can say stripped dot, and we can replace occurrences of /r as well. And we'll replace that with just an empty string, no space. And let's save that and run. And click random, and then films. And there we go. I think that looks good. Nice. And we can go to next, next, next. And that looks awesome. All right, great. So this video is running a little long. We'll wrap up in the next lesson and talk about a few things there. All right, I'll see you then.